Good afternoon. I was waiting for you to talk to me because that's what we are here, is it not? A community that talks with one another and shares with one another. When I was asked to introduce Mr. Moses to you, I thought what would be the best way to do so, and I didn't want to read this long litany of great stuff, because what I've come to learn about this man in the short time that we've been together is so much more than that. So what I decided to do was to go through articles and readings that I have and share with you the words that are associated with his name. Civil rights activist, educator, philosopher, author, influential black leader, Algebra Project, YPP, Radical Equations, MacArthur Fellowship, a gatekeeper, Alphonse Fletcher Senior Fellow, National Science Foundation, Heinz Award, an honorary Doctor of Science from Harvard. Last night, a group of students had dinner with Mr. Moses, and the thing that spoke to me above all else was his intellect, his heart, his humility, and how he made not only the time and the space in his comments to address the concerns of every single student in that room. I think that speaks a multitude for his focus, for his drive, for his intent, and for his life. This event is sponsored by the Days-Massolo Center. Special thanks to the math department, Sally in particular, and the class of 1976 Morris Fellowship. Let me say this, that I am not introducing Mr. Moses to you as a matter of due course, but as a means of letting you know how I have been impacted by what he has done, what he continues to do, and what I hope to get from it. I present to you Mr. Robert Moses, class of 26.
So I would like to start by saying what an enormous honor it is for me to be sitting beside you this afternoon in front of these people to ask you these questions. I'm just going to dive right in. Chapter 1 of your groundbreaking book, Radical Equations, Civil Rights from Mississippi to the Algebra Project, is provocatively titled Algebra and Civil Rights, ? It includes this sentence: the Algebra Project is founded on the idea that the ongoing struggle for citizenship and equality for minority people is now linked to an issue of math and science literacy. Could you expand on the connections that you see between your work as an activist and organizer for the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the South, and your work as an activist and an organizer in the Algebra Project?
Yes, okay. So it's okay if I look at the audience?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, of course. Yes, I don't mind.
How's everybody? Good. So you have to think that if you're thinking in broad terms, that the civil rights movement in this country happened as part of a planet-wide movement. And the planet-wide movement was for colonial people to gain political voice across the 20th century. And that movement hit this country after World War II, and the establishment of the United Nations in New York City. And the idea that took hold in African American culture that we also needed a political voice, right? So the voting, I think now, in reflection on it, was an organizing tool to attain access to the political dimension of our society, right? And so in that sense, it was a success, at least a limited success, that we did in some sense get some measure of the right to vote. We didn't get a full constitutional measure of the right to vote. And it has been used to open up the national politics to some extent for access to African Americans. I was in a meeting in Jackson at the Masonic Temple. It's going to be about 1962, maybe in the winter, 62, 63. And I was standing up front. And Lawrence Giat, who was from Pascagoula, Mississippi, was a SNCC field secretary, raised up to challenge me on a point. And as soon as he did, Lafayette Cerny got up. Okay, so Giat got up to challenge me, and Lafayette Cerny, who was from Ruleville, Mississippi, got up immediately to challenge Giat. Now, what I understood was that Lafayette would never get up to challenge me, right? And so it raised the question of, well, how are the meetings organized and who's standing up front? And how should they be organized to ensure that everybody, including the Lafayettes, actually participate? So we changed how we did our meetings. And we had a format where everyone, when they came in, and these were meetings where the sharecroppers, farmers, day laborers were coming once a month to Jackson. Some of them would get up at 4 in the morning to make this trip and meet all day. When they came in, they had to sign in on some problem which was local that had been discussed and had been communicated to the field secretaries that they wanted to work on. So they sat in groups that were working on a particular problem. And then when they went back, they had to work on the problem and then come back and figure out what they wanted to do about the problem. So it was a revelation to actually discover that the actual meeting place was our most important tool for the participation and the eventual leadership development of the people we were working with, right? Because out of this process emerged the people who became the leaders of the different efforts that we undertook during those days. So that's one thing, the issue of the meeting place. And the first was the issue of, well, what is the planet-wide motion, if you like, that gives rise to a movement, right? So in the 21st century, the planet-wide motion is the shift from the industrial to the information age technology, right? And in some senses, that shift is more pervasive than the shift from agriculture to industry, right? So that has brought with it a new literacy. So I'll tell you a story I tell often. I was on the witness stand in Greenville, Mississippi in the spring of 1963, and we had taken sharecroppers in Greenwood down to register to vote in the aftermath of a grease gun shooting on the highway. We had been grease gunned, Jimmy Travis, myself, and Randolph Blackwell. Jimmy caught the bullet, he was driving. And in the aftermath, we converged on Greenwood, and it happened that they had cut out the federal commodities, and so we raised food in Chicago. Dick Gregory flew airplane loads of food down. We told people that the reason they didn't have their federal commodities was because of the politics. So if they wanted the food, they had to go down to register. So a lot of people went down, and they arrested the SNCC field secretaries. So Kennedy was still president. Bobby Kennedy, Attorney General. Burke Marshall was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. And he filed suit against the city and had our cases removed to the Federal District Court in Greenville. So we bussed over loads of sharecroppers and filled up the courtroom. And Burke sent John Doe to be our lawyer. So the federal district judge, Taney, blanking on his name now. Anyway, he leaned over and he asked me just one question. He wanted to know, why is SNCC taking illiterates down to register to vote? So sharecropper illiteracy was the subtext of the right to vote, right? And basically we said, well, the country can't have its cake and eat it too. It can't deny a whole people access to literacy through politics and then turn around and say, well, you can't do politics because you're illiterate, right? So the fundamental issue of citizenship and what does it mean to be a citizen of the nation as opposed to just being a citizen of a state was at the heart of the civil rights movement then, and it's at the heart of the movement now. Because what I think we experienced in our last presidential election was, underneath it all, that the country has not and has so far refused to retool itself for what's needed in the information age technology. One of the things that's needed is that the new technology brings quantitative literacy on the table in the same way as industrial technology brought reading and writing on the table. So that judge, he wasn't thinking about quantitative literacy and math when he wanted to know why are you taking illiterates. He was just thinking about reading and writing. But in this century, quantitative literacy is on the table on a par with reading and writing for access to the economic arrangements which really require the ability to do what's roughly called knowledge work, right? As opposed to an education which is preparing you for what's roughly called factory work. And so, by and large, in the 20th century, most of the population was being prepared for factory work, and the country just simply has not retooled its education system so that we have an education system which prepares students for knowledge work. So the Algebra Project entered into this and took the general idea from the Mississippi Theater of the Civil Rights Movement of the idea that national citizenship is substantive, that it means something, and that the people who actually were the engines and the participants in the civil rights movement were not thinking that they were citizens of Alabama and Mississippi, and they were therefore in deep, deep trouble. They were thinking, we are also citizens of the country, and the country has a duty and an obligation to make that national citizenship substantive. So in a nutshell, we have also taken the idea about the meeting place into the classroom because mathematics classrooms notoriously do not focus with the students themselves as the center of the conversation about what is being taught and learned. And so we have developed ideas, which if we want, we can talk about later, that came from my sojourn at Harvard in the 50s when Willard Van Orman Quine was the star of Harvard's philosophy department, but also a mathematical logician and concerned with issues of the way in which language influences the development of elementary set theory, logic, and arithmetic. So that's a start on that question.
Something that you write about in the book is that a similarity between your work as an organizer in civil rights and also in the Algebra Project is that it's not a matter of somebody coming in and leading. It's a matter of the community wanting to achieve its own civil rights, wanting this math education. And in that sense, I mean, you were speaking about empowering students, but also empowering Black Americans in the South to vote, to become leaders of their own movement. And you feel the same thing has to happen in classrooms, that we can't just speak from above saying, you will learn this. There has to be a desire among students to demand this sort of education, to demand a quality background in math and science.
Right. So the movement actually was of figuring out how to work the demand side. So of course the students themselves initiated the demand in the sit-ins, right? And as that, they were leaders putting their own selves on the front lines. Ella Baker, who was the midwife for SNCC, she insisted that the students who were leading the sit-in movement should own their own movement, right? And that taught me, I think, the most profound lesson that I've learned about organizing. That is, if you're organizing to help something come into being that you are not going to be the leader of, right? So how does that happen, right? Ella showed, in some sense, how it happened with the sit-in movement itself. And our biggest example of that in Mississippi was the eventual formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. and the person who became the star of that party and a national figure, and you can look her up on YouTube, and her talk at the convention at the Credentials Committee in Atlantic City in 1964, Fannie Lou Hamer, right? So it was, it had to be a conscious decision to leave open what I think of as the media space, right? So at that time, there wasn't the kind of media spaces that we have now, and there were just 3 national channels. There was Jet Magazine and Ebony, right? And so it meant that when things happened, I'd refused to have my picture taken as the person who was sort of responsible for what happened. We would have local people, right, have their picture taken, right? So the media space was left open, right? And eventually, events kind of came together, and Mrs. Hamer was ready, and she stepped right smack into that media space. So the idea of organizing, for example, within the Algebra Project, students that I taught who were in middle school in the 1980s in Cambridge, Massachusetts, came down to Mississippi in the 1990s when we were at Brinkley Middle School in Jackson, Mississippi. And in 1995, in the summer, they came down, and some of them stayed across the winter. And space had been left open within the Algebra Project for the young people who were coming through to figure out, if they wanted to, how they wanted to participate in this work, right? In the sense that we did not try as adults who were running the Algebra Project to form a youth wing of the Algebra Project, right? We were doing the work, and we were inviting people who came through the work and graduated from the work to participate in the work. But we deliberately, and it has to be a conscious deliberation, because there's a lot of push from people who you employ, who get into it, who think, well, we need to organize the young people, right? As opposed to, well, let's see whether the young people can figure out whether they want to organize themselves, right? So it did happen. They came to me, I think it was in the spring of 1996, and said they had decided to organize themselves into a young people's project, and they had negotiated their first gig. They were going up into the Delta to teach some middle school teachers how to use the TI graphing calculator, right? And so they were on their way. But again, the issue is, well, what does it mean to organize? And so one of the issues is that you have to be conscious that you are trying to bring something into being that you're not going to be the leader of. So we are currently trying to organize a We the People Math Literacy Alliance in response to an NSF RFP, which was issued in 2016, calling on the nation to form a network of national alliances to broaden participation in STEM. Right? And so we looked at that RFP, and it referred us to some research by researchers at Stanford, Kania and Kramer, and articles they had written on something called collaborative impact theory. And so when we looked at it, we thought about the Mississippi theater of the Civil Rights Movement, that it had none of the collaborative institutions that they were talking about to collaborate with. So there were just no intermediate organizations of any kind to collaborate with doing the voting in Mississippi in the 1960s. And so what we had done, we thought about it, was collaborate with the people who had the problem, right? With the sharecroppers themselves and the farmers, day laborers, so forth. And we had also done what NSF was seeking. We had formed an alliance. So we formed an alliance of all the 4 major civil rights organizations: SNCC, CORE, SCLC, and NAACP. And we had also done what NSF was seeking. We had figured out one specific thing that we would work on, which was the right to vote. Right? So we took that idea to NSF and said, well, we want to form an alliance dealing with the issue of the bottom quartile. The idea is that, it wasn't radical to do voter registration per se in the 1960s. What was radical was to insist that the sharecroppers in the Delta get the right to vote. And that led us to our surprise, to the national party structure. So we weren't saying, our goal is to get algebra. Our goal is to make sure that the bottom quartile gets the math literacy they need for the 21st century. And that we want to collaborate with the students, their teachers, the administrators, and community people that support them. And we want to form a national alliance to do that. So we got funded. NSF funded about 40 groups in 2016. Then they got caught up in the new administration and its refusal to budget in 2017, but they still funded, I think, 17 more in 2017. But they had anticipated they would fund 5 national alliances in 2017, but they were not able to do that. They did fund at least, I think, 3 in 2018. And they're continuing. They want to grow a network of national alliances around this issue of broadening participation in STEM. So we have used our funding to try to develop, in this organizing mode, a national alliance, right? So we talked about the issue of, something that's coming into being you're not going to be the leader of. But then also there's the question of what is the consensus, particularly if you don't have money, right, around which people decide that they want to work together, right? So the idea, you don't actually create consensus to do this kind of work. You somehow have to flesh it out. People have to flesh out what it is that they agree on, right? To agree that they're going to bring their institution or they're going to bring their own personal life in a major way into working on a particular problem, right? So we are still in the process of fleshing out different points of that consensus, but we are well on our way to developing this national alliance, right? I'll stop right there for now.
A number of Hamilton grads every year go into teaching as a career. Some go to private schools, some go to Teach for America. A few used to go to Math for America, but I think that organization has now changed. And of course, among the faculty, we have a number of educators in the room. What advice can you provide to help Hamilton grads going into teaching and also faculty in the room in developing a more inclusive approach to teaching?
So we're in touch with Bobby Scott, who is the chairperson of the House Education and Labor Committee, which is going to take over, well, I guess they've already taken over with the shift in Congress since the midterm election. And we got to him through Bernie Sanders, and we got to Bernie Sanders through Danny Glover. We got to Danny Glover through Freedom Song, right? We got to Freedom Song through Phil Robinson, who did Field of Dreams, right? Remember Field of Dreams? Yes, so Phil did Field of Dreams, and then he read what you call his trilogy, I'm blanking on his name, the famous historian about the movement. Yes, America in the King Years. Taylor Branch, right. And so he approached me, he wanted to make a movie about what happened in the southwest corner of Mississippi in the 1961. And to do this, we pulled together all the families that had been involved in the Mississippi movement and tried to form a foundation. And so they would sign over their rights to their stories to the foundation, so any money that came from the movie could go to the foundation and the families, right? And so Phil wrote the script, but then he couldn't get it funded. It cost he wanted about $17 million to fund this movie, but it had no white actor or actress, so nobody would fund it. So it languished for about 10 years, and then Danny did Buffalo Soldiers for TNT. And so he had an in with TNT, and he came across the script and decided he wanted to do it. And so it got done for TNT as Freedom Song. You can look it up. And then he became involved and interested in the Algebra Project and came onto our board. So Danny's been on our board for over a decade. And then Danny travels the planet in his role as activist, and he got involved with Bernie Sanders in the 2016 presidential election and became a fellow of the Sanders Institute. And so that institute met in December in Burlington, Vermont. Danny asked me if I would go up with him. We went, we met Mr. Sanders, and I asked him if he would meet with us to consider some legislation. And as it happened, I was going to be in DC the following week at the meeting of the Congress Board for Mathematical Sciences, which is the kind of umbrella group. And Herb Clemens, who works with us and is a research mathematician at Ohio State, was a prominent member of the board, and he had arranged for myself and Katie Bellin, who is a math teacher at Fannie Lou Hamer School in New York City, to come talk to them. So we were going to be in D.C., and Bernie said yes, he would meet with us. And so Danny came down. We got Cortland Cox, who's head of the SNCC Legacy Group, and myself, and the person who's the glue in our office, Ben Moynihan, and we met with Bernie's people. And he said, well, legislation begins in the House, and he assigned his staff person to call over to Bobby Scott's committee, right? And it just happened that we called them, and the very next week we all came back and met with Bobby Scott's people. And so, of course, Congress got embroiled, as we all know, right? And so they have been, embroiled. And so we are looking, on our part, we began thinking about, and putting together a group that is really going to take the lead in approaching this legislation, right? And negotiating or seeing what is this process. So at the heart of all of this is you have to have in your mind a story about the country. So one thread of that story on this issue you can pick up with three voices, right, in three different centuries, right? So there's President Grant in 1875 in his State of the Union address asking for a constitutional amendment for education, for direct federal involvement in education, including the freed slaves. Then you jump to 1961 and James Conant. Now, James Conant was president of Harvard from 1933 to 53, and he was, of course, the architect of what we call America's meritocracy. And first, he recruited his dean, Henry Chauncey, and Chauncey came up with options. There was the SAT on the one hand, and then there was what was coming out of Iowa on the other. And Conant he said he wanted to go for intelligence, right? And the SAT was to be an intelligence barometer. So he used the SAT so that Harvard could admit public school students for the first time in its history. And so the SAT came into being, and the Ivy League schools used it throughout the 30s. And then after World War II, he set up ETS, right? Conant went on to be ambassador to Germany for the Marshall Plan, and then came back and took a look at public schools, high schools. So he wrote this book, Slums and Suburbs, and he published it in 1961. And he takes up Grant's argument. He says, well, we didn't get the amendment. What we got instead was a tight caste system, right? And let me see if I can actually find his words here. So after the victory of the North, the people of the United States, through their duly elected representatives in Congress, acquiesced for generations in the establishment of a tight caste system as a substitute for Negro slavery. As we now recognize so plainly, but so belatedly, a caste system finds its clearest manifestation in an educational system. So that's what we were looking at. That's what that judge was asking me about on the witness stand in 1963. So it's hard for the country to think that they have been running an educational system to buttress a caste system. It's hard for the country to get its mind around that that's what actually is going on. Right? I'll stop right there for now.
In the 1960s, in your book, you write how the civil rights movement began with the students who sat in lunch counters in the South, the sit-ins. And Amzie Moore, I believe, felt that it was important to go beyond integrating lunch counters to increasing voter registration. And students from the South, but also students from the North, and I believe one student from Hamilton College participated with the Freedom Riders to come in and help with the drive to register Black Americans to vote in Mississippi. What do you feel is the role students can play now in activism? So the 1960s was a period of intense student activism in very important work of the country. What do you feel students today can do? What sort of activism can they participate in?
Yeah.
We just recently passed the anniversary of the Parkland shooting. A number of high school students were very active for a while after that, trying to affect gun control legislation.
Right, yeah. Yeah, they're still active. We actually, the Alliance is doing work. We have the Broward County school system in which Parkland is located is a member of the Alliance. And we are working in 2 high schools there, one in Hallandale and the other in Coconut Creek. And of course, the Parkland students are in a section of the city or of the county which is well-to-do, right? And so I really, so one question, and it's a question about their activism and really difficult choices and decisions, because the new governor, I think his name is Scott, who was just elected in the midterm elections in Florida, appointed to his state board of education a parent whose daughter was murdered in the Parkland shooting, and who has publicly made it his mission to get rid of the superintendent, Runcie, who is African American and who is the reason we are in Broward County, right? And I don't know what the position of the students are, right, about that issue, right? So these are really difficult times, right, for young people. But to back up and take a look at your question, my sense is that the young people, the generation in college and coming into college, are going to be faced with a very deep constitutional issue, which is whether they are going to decide to embrace the preamble in a sense which includes the undocumented, and open up and actually move the country to a point where it revisits its constitution and rethinks what are the fundamental values that it wants in the Constitution for the 21st century and onward, right? So let me just say that again, that if you think about the preamble is an open invitation for anyone who takes the geography of the country as their home to enter into the constitutional conversation. It didn't have to be that. Patrick Henry didn't want it to be that. He complained, right? Where does this we the people come from, right? We need to be talking about we the states, or we the citizens of the states. And if they had written we the citizens of the several states, then they could be thought of as documented. Right? They're documented. The only way to document themselves is as the citizens of the states. Right? But there's no country yet for them to document themselves as citizens of the country. So they basically are undocumented, issuing a proclamation about who the people are, who are the first set of people that own and establish the Constitution. Right? You have to think about the preamble in conjunction with Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3. So that section of the Constitution establishes another class of that has constitutional status, in this case, Africans, as constitutional property, right? So Africans have constitutional status. They are constitutional property, and the Constitution wants to make sure that if they decide to own themselves, that the federal government has the obligation to go fetch them and return them to their property owner, right? Which is the class in the preamble, right? So Africans in that sense are the first and really large class of undocumented people in the country, right? And they spend a lot of their energy, right, across the next 75 years trying to figure out how to document themselves, right? That's the whole runaway slavery issue, right? They want to leave this status as undocumented and become, in some sense, documented as a citizen of some state or of the country, right? And of course, this metastasizes in the Dred Scott decision in 1857, when Taney lays out for the whole country, look, this is what's going on, right? This is what you signed on to. The preamble does not intend to include Africans in any way, right? And it doesn't matter if they're enslaved or free. They are not part of this political community established by the preamble and the Constitution, right? So the country has always struggled with its undocumented population. Right? It's not a new thing. That's beginning just now. Right? The country has gone. Now, the way it resolved its problem with the undocumented before was it went to war. Right? Right? That's what it did, right, to resolve that problem. Right? it's not clear how it's going to resolve its problem going forward. But for the young people, I think it is clear that this is a problem that you have to really think about. And I would suggest you think about it in terms of the preamble.
Would you be willing to entertain a question from the
Anytime,
audience?
yes, sure. I can
There's
open
somebody
it
from
up.
the audience who would like to ask Bob Moses a question. Do you have a question?
I do.
All right.
My question stems from conversation that we had earlier. And you gave this wonderful example of how in developing the Algebra Project and understanding A plus B equals C and the approach, the uniqueness of your approach to bringing in the students that you were targeting. And I'd like you to share that with people because I think we could benefit a lot from going back to basics and answering fundamental questions. Preamble.
And so what Phyllis is talking about, we had a little demonstration at the dinner. And I mentioned before that Quine, who was Harvard's philosophy star in the 50s, he concerned himself with actually looking at how language was what he called regimented to give rise to the sciences and mathematics. And he was concerned with elementary arithmetic, set theory, and logic, and the regimentation of the language. And what he was saying was that what emerged from the regimentation was nobody's spoken language. It was a conceptual language that nobody spoke, right? And so I took that idea into thinking about the teaching and learning of math as the kids transition from arithmetic to algebra, right? I'm hesitant to do this, but you really want to do the demonstration? Yeah. You do? Okay, so we need 2 volunteers to come down and stand up. You just have to stand up for a minute.
Do they have to be good in math?
No. No, they just have to be good at standing. Okay. All right, so you need to introduce yourselves. Tell everybody your name, just your name.
I'm Margie.
So it's Margie and Ed, right?
Ian.
Okay.
Ian.
Ian, okay, sorry. So the question that everybody has to talk to your neighbor about the answer, and it's not a trick question. Everybody can observe the answer, right? And this is one of the things that Quine made a big point about, was that you anchor science in observation sentences, right? And observation sentences are such that if you talk about them and you make an observation, then everybody who knows the language will agree whether your observation is right or wrong, right? Okay, so the question is, who's taller? So just talk to your neighbor and answer the question using both their names. right? Use both their names. Just please actually say to your neighbor your answer, right? Using both their names. And you all can sit down. Thank you. Yes. Yes, we want the answer.
Ian is taller than Mars.
Good. Everyone agrees? Yes. Okay. So the next question is, it's a question that turns your attention to where is information encoded in sentences, right? And so where in this sentence do you know or are you given information that you are talking about their height?
In the adjective.
Okay, what do you call the adjective?
Taller.
Okay, so, yes. So, anyone want to expand on that adjective? I don't know how you think about how sentences, syntactical categories are organized, but anybody else? But she's right, in essence. Anybody else want to say what that part of the sentence is in their predicate? Okay, if you say predicate, what would you say is the predicate?
The verb
Is? Okay. All right, so anyway, it's in there, somewhere in the is taller than. It's certainly not in the names, right? We don't know. We're talking about the height from the name, Ian, or from the name, Margot, right? So algebra, math isn't going to like that. It's not going to develop a representation for is taller than. Right? So what is it going to do? It wants to represent this, right? That Ian is taller than Margot, but it doesn't like is taller than. So it's not going to represent it. It's not going to have a symbol in all of math for is taller than. So what is it going to do? How does it resolve that problem? No. No mathematicians answer. Yes.
I mean, I'm also a mathematician. And it sets up a function that you can put information into.
But what does it actually do? Tell me. Tell me what you do with that sentence. What do you actually do with the words, the sentence?
You use variables in place of the meanings.
Well, what variables? Tell me what you actually do.
So you could use like x is Ian's height and y is Margie's height, and then just put x is greater than y.
Okay, all right. So back up and slow down, right? Instead of variables, tell us about your new names.
Well, the name would just be a name for Ian's height and a name for Margie's.
Well, what were the two new names you just introduced us to?
The x and y.
No, those are not names, those are variables. So variables hold a place for names,
Right.
right? So what were the names?
With the names of what?
You just said them.
Oh, Ian and Margie.
No, those were not the names you said. So this is the issue, right? You said the names, but you don't recognize them as names. Do you remember what you said?
The x is greater than y.
And then you said something else. You said about X and Y. What did you say about them?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure, right? Anybody know what he said? Yes, say it again louder. Yes, you actually said that. Do you remember now? So this is part of the problem. Math deals with the most obvious features, right, of our experience. And so we don't pay attention to what's obvious, right? Right. So obviously, right, you were talking about Ian's height and Margot's height, but not so obvious that you were actually creating two names, right? And so what's happened is that information in the predicate, if we're going to call is taller than the predicate, has been divided, right? So a piece of that information, the quality of tallness, has been shifted into the names, and a piece of the information, the quantity, is greater than, has been left, right? But you've never heard anybody going around who's looking at Ian and Margot say, guess what? The height of Ian is greater than the height of Margot. You've never heard anybody say that, right? It's just not part of ordinary discourse. So this was Quine's point, and you can pursue this point further and further, right? Because ordinary discourse is going to pile more information into that predicate and say, well, Ian is 1 inch taller than, right, Margot. And math is not going to let you put a 1 in the middle of that greater than sign, right? Right. So anyway, so because I was in an unlikely position and then went in an unlikely path, we introduced this idea of looking at how the language the students own becomes an asset for them. Because it's often said, well, they don't own the King's English, and so therefore they have trouble. But the King's English is not the English that the math symbols are derived from, right? And so the question is, so instead of a book with the King's English, an experience where they can, just like we had here, where they can write and think about in their own language and transform it into the conceptual language from which the symbolic representations flow, right? So we work really hard at figuring out, well, what are mathematical concepts that we can embed in experiences that allow the students to actually think about and sort of play with, in some sense, in their own language as they are learning their math, right? Students don't think this is doing math. So it takes a while for them to come to the idea that they are learning math. So in our experience, you have another shot at the kids who are failing on these state tests as they leave middle school in 8th grade. If you need 2 summers and 2 full years, you need to grab them in the summer before the 9th grade, keep them through the 9th grade, work them in the summer before the 10th grade and through the 10th grade. And if you can find a school or a school system which allows you to do that without saying that, well, they have to prepare for these tests, right? By the end of the 10th grade year, you can get them ready so they're ready to go on in the 11th and 12th grade, right? But the history that I laid out for you and Conant's analysis of, you know, our educational system as a manifestation of the caste system has prevented that.
Thank you. I just thought that was so fun last night. It made me want to learn math all over again. Really, and I'm going back to school, okay? So you're coming to see me.
I think what we can do is thank Bob Moses for coming to visit his alma mater and speak about this afternoon.
Thank you.